The blood court of Mirev had not seen a human stand before the high throne in 400 years, and the last one had been dragged there in chains. Vera Sinclair walked in on her own 2 feet. The chamber stretched beneath the city of Prague like a cathedral that had forgotten how to pray, its vaulted ceilings lost in shadow, its black marble floors reflecting the cold blue fire of 100 enchanted torches. 12 ancient vampires occupied the curved dais of the High Council, their white hair cascading like frozen waterfalls, their pale faces carved with centuries of contempt. At their center stood the high throne, obsidian and silver, older than the city above it, and upon it sat a man who had not been a man for 600 years, Xavian Mirev, king of the Blood Court, sovereign of the Old Compact, did not move when the doors opened. He did not need to. The entire room breathed differently when he breathed, like weather systems orienting around a mountain. He was white-haired and pale as the moon through winter glass, sharp-jawed and impossibly still, dressed in black that absorbed the torchlight rather than reflecting it. His eyes were the color of a deep bruise, violet shading to black at the edges, and they had been fixed on the chamber doors for exactly 7 seconds before Vera stepped through them. He had known she would come. He had prayed she would not. The blood court erupted. Councillor Aldroveth, oldest and cruelest of the 12, rose from his seat with a sound like tearing silk. His white robes pooled behind him. His voice filled the chamber like smoke fills a locked room. "She has no place here. Remove the human, she stays." Xavian's voice was low and utterly absolute. It did not raise itself. It did not need to. It struck the marble floor and bounced back up through every set of feet in the room, a physical thing, a declaration made of stone. Aldroveth's lip curled. His fangs were old ivory, slightly yellowed with age, and they showed when he was angry. "The charge has been brought by 3 houses of the court, my king. Blood law requires your answer. The human female known as Vera Sinclair has been documented in your private company over 41 consecutive nights. She has been seen in the lower palace. She has been given access to restricted corridors. She has been granted your protection mark." His silver-ringed finger pointed across the chamber like an accusation made visible. "She carries your scent, Xavian Mirev, deliberately given, which means either you have violated the covenant of separation between our kind and hers, or you intend to." The 12 council members stirred like a disturbed nest of white ravens. Aldroveth's voice dropped to something intimate and poisonous. "The court demands you renounce the human, cast off your protection. Let the houses determine what is to be done with her, or answer for why you will not." Xavian had opened his mouth. He had been about to speak, and Vera Sinclair, who had worked the late shift at Meridian Bar and Grill for 3 years, and had therefore learned exactly what it looked like when powerful men tried to decide something over a woman's head, stepped forward from the doorway where she had been standing and said, clearly, and without a tremor, "He doesn't need to answer that. I do." The silence was total. Then it was something worse than silence. It was the held breath of 12 ancient predators suddenly becoming very, very interested. Vera had known they would look at her like that. She had stood in the employee break room at Meridian exactly 9 days ago and explained to Xavian with great precision what a bad idea this all was, while he sat on the edge of the break room table with his arms folded and watched her with those violet dark eyes and said nothing, because he had already known she was right and had chosen not to care. That had been the beginning, or rather, not the beginning at all. The beginning had been 3 months earlier and several floors above any underground court. Meridian was the kind of bar that attracted people who did not want to be found. This was not an accident. It occupied a basement level in Prague's Josefova district, old Jewish quarter, the city's historic bones, pressing up through centuries of modern renovation. The clientele ranged from academics to diplomats to the sort of beautiful, ageless people who tipped in old currency and ordered drinks that had not been fashionable since 1920. Vera had been working there since she was 23, which meant she had been working there long enough to recognize the regulars, the occasional vampires among them, and to understand the difference between dangerous and threatening. Dangerous, she had decided, was simply a quality some people carried. Threatening was a choice they made with it. The man who had come in on a Tuesday in October had been dangerous the way ancient rivers were dangerous. Quietly, essentially, without announcement. He had sat at the far end of the bar, away from the other guests, and ordered a glass of red wine that Vera had privately noticed he never drank, and he had read something on his phone with the focused attention of a man accustomed to making decisions that affected many people. He had tipped generously. He had said, "Please" and "thank you" in English, with an accent that pulled at several different centuries. He had not once tried to catch her eye in the way men sometimes did when they wanted something from her they had not been offered. He came back Wednesday, Thursday, the following Tuesday. By the third week, Vera had stopped pretending she was not curious. "You never drink the wine," she said on a Friday night when the bar was loud enough that she could say it without it feeling like an accusation. He had looked up from whatever he was reading. Close up, she had noticed for the first time that his eyes were the wrong color for a human being. Not dramatically wrong, just subtly, beautifully, definitely not quite right. "No," he agreed. "I order it because it gives me a reason to sit here. You could just sit here." The proprietor seems the sort of man who prefers a transactional relationship with his bar guests. Vera had laughed before she could stop herself. He was not wrong. Her employer, Mr. Hadrian Voss, was exactly that sort of man. "Fair enough," she said. "What are you reading?" "Correspondence from people who want things from me that I am not yet inclined to give them." "That sounds exhausting." "It is a great deal more exhausting than ordering wine I do not drink and reading a book I have already read," he said. And there was something in the way he said it that was not quite a smile, but was adjacent to one, warm in the vicinity of a smile. "You are Vera." "My name tag is right there, I know. I have been looking at it for 3 weeks. She had felt something shift in her chest. Not dramatically, just the small, quiet lurch of something paying attention. "You have me at a disadvantage," she said. "I do not know your name." "Xavian," he said. "That is an unusual name. I am an unusual person." This had been true in ways she had not yet understood, and ways she had already begun to suspect. The nights that followed had a rhythm to them that felt less like accident and more like gravity. He came to Meridian. He sat at the far end of the bar. He ordered wine he did not drink. And Vera, who was not a woman who traded in illusions or comfortable lies, who had grown up the daughter of a nurse and a civil engineer, and had inherited from both of them an absolute commitment to looking directly at things as they were, began to understand several facts simultaneously. The first fact was that Xavian Mirev was a vampire. She had suspected it before she confirmed it, and she confirmed it on the night. He caught a glass. She had knocked off the counter so fast that human reflex could not have accounted for it. Not the catching itself. People with quick hands caught things. It was that he had been looking away when the glass fell, and he had still caught it, and the motion had been too fluid, too certain, with none of the surprise of someone who had not known they were going to move that quickly. He had caught it and set it down and met her eyes and waited, and she had said, very calmly, "Thank you," and gone back to work. She had thought about it for a week before she said anything. The second fact was that she liked him, not in the way she sometimes liked customers who were entertaining or interesting or reliably not awful to the service staff. She liked him in the more serious and less comfortable way, the way that sits in the back of your throat and changes the quality of quiet moments. He was brilliant and dry-humored and genuinely curious about her thoughts. He asked questions the way careful people asked questions, not to fill silence, but because he actually wanted the answers. He had once spent 40 minutes asking her opinion on urban architectural history after she mentioned, in passing, that she was taking night classes in it, and his questions had been so precise and insightful that she had eventually asked him whether he had studied it himself. "I watched most of it happen," he had said, which she had taken, at the time, as a joke. The third fact was the dangerous one. He was protecting her, and had been since approximately the second week. She had not noticed it at first, because it was not intrusive, but she noticed, one night when she was walking to the late tram, after closing, that the two men who had been following her since the Shozefov station were no longer following her. She had not heard or seen what had happened to change that. She only knew that one moment the hairs on the back of her neck were raised, and the next they were not. She had said, when she arrived at work the following Tuesday and found Xavian already at the bar, "Did you do something about the men who were following me last Thursday?" He had looked at her for a moment before answering, "Yes, what did you do?" Persuaded them that continuing in that direction would be significantly against their interests. Were they vampires? A longer pause this time. Yes. She had set down the glass she was polishing and looked at him directly. "Are you going to explain what is happening?" And he had said, with the careful, measured tone of a man who had been hoping to postpone this conversation and had known from the beginning that he could not, "I think that would be better done somewhere other than here." He had taken her to the palace the following evening, not a palace in the storybook sense, though it was beneath a building that was, above ground, a very old and very beautiful townhouse that Xavian owned. Below street level, the architecture changed languages entirely. The underground complex had been built in the 14th century and had been expanded 5 times since, always downward, always deeper, its corridors mapped in the memory of the vampires who lived there, rather than any document that could be found and read. It smelled like old stone and expensive things, and something else, something electric and old, like the air before lightning. Xavian had told her the truth in a room lined with books that had not been printed so much as assembled by hand, by candlelight, in languages that had changed beyond recognition since they were written. He had told her about the Blood Court, the governing body of vampire society in Central Europe, and about the Covenant of Separation, the ancient law that prohibited formal ties of protection or attachment between vampires and non-bonded humans. He had told her about the 3 minor houses who had noticed his attendance at Meridian and had begun watching her, and about the protection mark he had placed on her, invisibly, through the application of his blood to the threshold of the bar door 3 weeks earlier, and about what that mark meant under blood law. "It means you have claimed her," Vera had said slowly, working through it. "It means I have protected her. In blood law, Protection of a human without court sanction carries the implication of a deeper bond. The distinction matters legally, but the result is the same. He had been standing near the window, very still, watching her process this with those careful, dark violet eyes. I did not intend for this to become a legal matter. I intended to stop 2 minor house scouts from tracking you. You had caught their attention because you had caught mine, and in vampire politics, proximity to the king creates risk for those nearby. Why did I catch your attention? She had not meant it to come out sounding the way it did, direct and a little breathless. He had looked at her for a long moment. Because you looked at me like a person who looks at things honestly, he said, and it has been a very long time since anyone looked at me like that. She had stood there, in the book-lined room 6 floors beneath Prague, and felt the full weight of something irreversible settling around her shoulders like a coat she had not asked for, and found, terrifyingly, that she wanted to keep 3 months, 41 nights. Conversations that lasted until the approaching dawn forced Xavian to the deeper levels of the palace. History lessons that turned into philosophical arguments, that turned into the kind of comfortable silences that only exist between people who have already established that they like each other enough to endure one. She learned the architecture of his world, the 7 great houses, the blood court's authority over them, the 3 ancient laws that governed vampire life, and the complex web of alliances and resentments that ran through vampire politics like fault lines through rock. He learned the architecture of hers, her mother's insistence on directness, her father's love of structures and systems, the night classes she was taking at Charles University, the novel she had been attempting and abandoning for 3 years, the way she thought about fairness and what it meant, practically speaking, to be accountable for the impact of your power on people who had less of it. That last conversation had gone very quiet at the end, and Xavian had looked at the table between them for a long time before saying, "I have not always done that well." "I know," she said. "I am not asking you to have been perfect. I am asking you whether you think about it now." "I think about it," he said, "considerably more than I did before I met you." She had understood, in that moment, that what she felt was not the uncomplicated delight of a new attraction. It was the complicated, serious, dangerous thing that comes after. You have seen someone clearly and chosen them anyway. It was the kind of feeling that demanded honesty about its own weight. She had told him so in almost exactly those words, on a Sunday night when the underground library was lit by old lamps, and they were sitting across from each other with barely enough space between them to call it distance. He had gone very still, not the supernatural stillness of a creature built for patience, but the human kind, the kind that happens when something touches a place you have been keeping carefully away from other people. "Vera," he said, very quietly. "You do not have to say it back," she said. "I am not telling you to change anything. I am telling you because it is true, and I do not lie about true things." "I know you do not," he said, and then carefully, like a man dismantling something he had built to protect himself, "I have not allowed myself to want anything with consequences in a very long time." "I know," she said. "I am asking whether you might want to try." He had crossed the distance between them in a way that was not supernatural at all, and kissed her once deliberately, with every ounce of a 600-year-old person's accumulated understanding of how much it costs to choose something real. She had kissed him back with 3 months of falling and the full force of being someone who looks at things honestly. It had. been the best 3 days of her life before the court summons arrived. The summons had come in the form of Aldroveth's second, a young-faced ancient vampire named Soravel, who appeared at the threshold of the palace with a sealed black document and a face arranged into careful neutrality. The seal was the blood court's emblem, a stylized crown above a drop of blood enclosed in a circle, and it had been pressed so hard into the wax that the design had cracked slightly, which Xavian told her afterward was deliberate, a mark of accusation rather than invitation. He had read it alone first. Then he had come to find her. She had been in the library with her university reading. 3 dense books about modernist urban planning spread across the table, and she had looked up at his face and known before he spoke that something significant had shifted. "The court has called a formal censure session," he said. "Aldroveth has brought charges. 3 houses of the court support him. Against you, against both of us." He sat down. She noticed that he was doing the thing he sometimes did when he was controlling something, holding himself with a careful, deliberate stillness that was not natural ease, but manufactured calm. "The charge is violation of the covenant of separation, my protection of you without court sanction, and the implication of a bond." He paused. "They will ask me to renounce you formally, to remove the protection mark, to sever any claim of association under blood law." She had been quiet for a moment. Then she said, "What happens to me if you do?" He held her gaze. "The 3 houses who brought the charge have expressed interest in questioning you regarding your knowledge of blood court location, personnel, and custom." "Questioning," she repeated. "Their preferred methods of questioning are not things I will allow to happen to you. But if you renounce me formally, you lose legal standing to prevent it." "Yes. So the choice they are presenting you with is renounce me and lose me, or refuse to renounce me and start a war with 3 courthouses." "That is an accurate summary." "Yes." She had closed the urban planning book. She had looked at him for a long time. Then she said, "What are the alternatives that they are hoping you will not think of?" He had looked at her with something that was becoming very familiar on his face. When she did this, the sudden brightness behind the violet eyes of a person who has found someone who thinks the way they find most useful. "There is one alternative," he said. "Under blood law, a formally declared bond between a vampire and a human requires court ratification to dissolve. If the bond is declared before the censure session, the court cannot require its dissolution without a full council vote of 9 out of 12. Aldroveth has 3. He cannot reach 9, so we declare the bond first. It is not a small thing. A declared bond under blood law is binding by vampire custom. It is a declaration of permanent formal attachment." He paused. "It is the vampire equivalent of a proposal, Vera." She had been 26 years old and 3 months into knowing this man, and she had felt none of the panic she might have expected. She had felt the same gravity she always felt around him, the same clear, serious certainty of someone who looks at things honestly and calls them what they are. "I know what it is," she said. "I am asking whether you want to do it." "I have wanted," he said, very carefully, "considerably more than has been advisable for the last several weeks. That is not an answer." "Yes," he said, "it is." They had declared the bond in a private ceremony witnessed only by Casaveth, Xavian's chamberlain, an 800-year-old vampire who had served 6 kings and cried with great dignity throughout the proceedings. And Vera's friend Lena, who had arrived from above ground with enormous eyes and a complete willingness to accept everything she was seeing at face value, because Lena was that sort of person and Vera had always loved her for it. The ceremony involved an exchange of blood which was deeply personal under vampire custom, and a spoken declaration in old court language, which Xavian had translated for her line by line, before the ceremony with the focused, earnest attention of a man who wanted her to understand every word she was agreeing to. She had memorized her lines in the original because she felt that if she was going to say them, she should say them properly. When she spoke the old court words, Casavathad made a small, involuntary sound, and Xavian had gone very still, in the particular way that meant he was managing something he was not going to say out loud, and afterward he had told her that no one had spoken the old court declaration in its original form in over 2 centuries, and that it was considered an act of profound and unusual commitment. "I did tell you I do not lie about true things," she had said. "You did," he agreed, and held her, with his hands in her hair, like she was something he had been keeping himself from reaching for a very long time. The court summons had arrived the morning after the ceremony. Aldroveth had, through Sorovel, demanded the session proceed regardless. He had clearly expected the bond declaration to happen, because his message had included language explicitly demanding Xavian's renunciation of all claimed associations formed in violation of the covenant, including any recently formalized bond declarations intended to obstruct court proceedings. He is claiming the bond is invalid because it was formed under legal duress, Xavian had explained. Is that a real legal argument? It is. Creative one, it has never been tested because no one has ever formed a bond specifically as legal strategy before. Aldroveth will argue the intent invalidates the declaration. That is actually an interesting argument, Vera had said. Xavian had looked at her. I am not saying I agree with it, she clarified. I am saying it is an interesting argument and we should be prepared to counter it effectively. They had spent the next 2 days doing exactly that, working through blood court law with the focused energy of 2 people who had both, in different ways, trained themselves to think clearly under pressure. Vera had brought her analytical mind and her complete absence of deference to ancient institutions simply for being ancient. Xavian had brought 600 years of knowing exactly where the fault lines in the court's authority ran, and which of its own precedents contradicted it. And then she had gotten up on the morning of the session and told him she was coming with him. He had been quiet for a long time. Vera, he had finally. Do not, she said. You understand that the court chamber is a room full of vampires who have been alive since before the concept of human rights was a coherent idea. I understand that, and that I cannot guarantee your safety if this goes wrong. You cannot guarantee it from here either. If Aldroveth has what he needs to challenge the bond's validity. She had looked at him steadily. I am not coming because I think I need to rescue you. I am coming because this is about me too, and I am not the kind of person who lets other people speak for her when she can speak for herself. Aporso, I have a legal counter-argument that you have not thought of yet. He had, she knew, been managing several large and complicated feelings simultaneously. The protective instinct, which in a vampire of his age and power was less an instinct and more a foundational drive, pulling hard against him. The pride which was not simple vanity, but a deep and genuine regard for her capability. The love which was new and serious and already too large to be managed sensibly. He had said, "What is the argument?" She had told him. He had been silent for a long moment, and then he had said, "That is correct," with the tone of a man who was in considerable trouble, and was also rather impressed about it. They had gone to the court together. Now Vera stood on the black marble floor of the blood-court chamber with 12 ancient vampires, looking at her like weather events, study new geography. And she thought about everything that had brought her here, and she said, clearly for the entire room, "My name is Vera Sinclair. I am the declared bond partner of Xavian Mirev under blood law, and I am prepared to address the charges." Aldroveth stared at her. The old vampire had clearly been looking forward to this session, and a human woman opening her mouth and addressing the court directly had not been part of what he had been looking forward to. His face moved through several expressions before settling on a contempt so old it had calcified. "You have no standing to speak in this chamber under the compact of declared bonds. A bond partner of any vampire holds derivative standing in proceedings that directly threaten the declared bond," Vera said. Book 3, Section 8 of the Blood Court's own codified law. I looked it up. In the 900 years since Book 3, Section 8 had been written, no human had ever invoked it, primarily because no human had ever known it existed. The sound that moved through the 12 council members was subtle, but it was there, the particular rustle of people recalibrating. Aldroveth recovered. He was old enough to be very good at recovering. The bond itself is under challenge. Its validity is the subject of these proceedings. You cannot derive standing from a bond we are here to dissolve. You are here to argue it should be dissolved, Vera said. It has not been dissolved. Until a majority vote of 9 council members so orders, the bond is legally active, and my standing with it. She looked at the other 11 council members with the directness that had nothing theatrical about it. Just a woman who had decided to look at something and was doing it. The legal precedent you would need to revoke. A declared bond, retroactively, would require that you demonstrate the declaration was false at the time of its making. A declaration made under strategic awareness of legal consequence is not the same as a false declaration. People propose marriage because they are about to lose someone they love all the time. The urgency of the situation does not make the feeling false. She paused. Does it? The chamber was very quiet. One of the 12, a smaller, silver-haired woman near the end of the dais, whose name Vera did not know, but whose expression had shifted from contemptuous to calculating, leaned slightly forward. Aldroveth said, "The human is attempting to manipulate the proceedings with emotional rhetoric." "I am attempting to address the substance of your legal argument," Vera said, without raising her voice. "You have claimed the bond is invalid because it was formed in awareness of legal consequence. I am pointing out that the law does not support that interpretation. If you have a different legal basis for your challenge, I would genuinely like to hear it." Xavian, on the throne, had gone very still. Not the managed stillness of someone controlling himself, but the deep, genuine stillness of someone completely arrested by what they were watching. Vera could feel his attention on her, the way you feel heat from a fire, directional and warm. Even across the chamber, Aldroveth turned to him. He had been outmaneuvered on the legal ground, and he knew it, and the way he knew it made his voice cold with the particular anger of very old things that do not change. "She is still human, my king. The covenant of separation exists for a reason. The mixing of mortal blood and immortal politics weakens us. One woman's facility with our law does not change what she is." "No," Xavian said, speaking for the first time since Vera had stood forward. His voice was quiet, and it filled every corner of the room the way deep water fills a vessel, complete and without gaps. "It does not. She is human. She is brilliant and honest, and she has more integrity than every person in this room combined. and I am aware that some of you find that insulting." He rose from the throne, and the room shifted around him, the way rooms shifted around forces of nature, redistributing itself to accommodate something that would not accommodate it. The covenant of separation was written to prevent vampires from exploiting humans, from treating them as resources, from using their mortality as leverage. He descended the 3 steps of the throne d'Adi with the unhurried precision of a man who has never needed to hurry because everything waits for him. I invite any member of this court to demonstrate how a formal bond of mutual declaration, freely entered by both parties with full knowledge of its terms, constitutes exploitation. Silence. In 400 years on this throne, Xavian continued, I have watched this court use the covenant as a shield when it suited them and as a weapon when that suited them better. I have watched Aldraveth's house buy human silence with fear and call it separation. I have watched Councillor Sorovel's secondary house run human servants in conditions the covenant was explicitly designed to prohibit. His violet eyes moved across the 12 faces with a precision that left marks. Do not bring me the covenant tonight as though any of you believe in what it says. Aldraveth stood. He was very tall when he stood, and the old ivory of his fangs showed again. You have made yourself vulnerable, he said, and there was something in it that sounded less like an argument and more like a threat. A king with a human bond partner is a king who can be broken. We are not the only court in Europe, Mirev. The Eastern courts will hear of this. The Meridian Compact vampires will see an opening. You have given every house that wants your throne a crowbar. I know, Xavian said simply. The simplicity of it landed in the chamber like a stone in still water. I know, he repeated. I have considered every consequence. I have spent 3 months considering every consequence, because that is what I do, and is why I have held this throne for 400 years. He looked at Vera then, directly across the black marble floor, and the thing in his face was not the careful, managed presentation of a king, but the unguarded expression of a person who has made their most important choice and knows it. I have also spent 3 months discovering what it means to be in the company of someone who makes me better at being what I am. Not weaker, more careful, more accountable, more interested in whether the power I hold is being used the way it should be. He returned his gaze to the council. That is not a vulnerability. That is the difference between a king and a tyrant. The small, silver-haired council member, who Vera would later learn, was Miravel of the House of Sylvain, oldest council member after Aldraveth, spoke for the first time. Her voice was very quiet and very precise. The declared bond stands as legally formed. The court's charge requires 9 votes to dissolve it. Aldraveth has submitted 3 house proxies. He does not have 9. She paused. I will not be a 4th. Aldraveth turned to her with fury in every line of his ancient face. Nor I, said another council member from the far end of the dais. Then a third. Aldraveth looked at Xavian. The fury was still there, but something older had appeared behind it. Something that had, perhaps, been waiting for this session to produce exactly this information. This is not finished, he said. Actually, Vera said, because she had one more thing to say, and she was going to say it. It is. Aldraveth looked at her with an expression that suggested he was not accustomed to being interrupted twice by the same human in one evening. Under Blood Court statute of finality, Vera said, a censure proceeding that fails to achieve the required majority cannot be re-brought by the same houses on the same charge within 50 years. You have already played your hand. You do not have the votes, and you cannot try again for 50 years. She held his gaze without flinching. Aldroveth. She used his name without title deliberately. She had read enough blood court custom to know it was a significant omission, not rude by human standards, by vampire standards, a precise statement of standing relative to the speaker. She had standing, she had just earned it. In this room, from this court, by their own law, the chamber was extraordinarily quiet. Then Councillor Mirev made a sound that might, in someone younger, have been a laugh. Aldroveth descended from the dais without another word. His robes swept the black marble. He did not look at Vera again. He looked once at Xavian. And whatever passed between two vampires in that look, Vera could not read it fully. But she saw Xavian receive it with complete stillness, and something that was not quite satisfaction and not quite relief, but lived in the territory between them. The council members dispersed. Some lingered, and two of them approached Vera with careful, assessing curiosity rather than hostility. And she answered their questions with the same directness she brought to everything, and Xavian appeared from somewhere near the chamber door, with an expression of overwhelming pride that the elderly chamberlain made no effort to conceal. When the chamber was nearly empty, Xavian came to her. He stood in front of her on the black marble floor of the oldest vampire court in Central Europe, and looked at her face with an expression that was doing several things at once, all of them significant. "You memorized the statute of finality," he said. "I memorized several statutes," Vera said. That was the most useful one. You used his name without title." Was that too much? His voice had changed. The formal register of the chamber was gone from it. He was speaking to her the way he spoke to her in the library, the way that had no performance in it. It was exactly right. It was the correct statement of exactly what you are in this room now. He raised one hand and touched her face, which he had been careful not to do in the chamber itself, maintaining the precise professional distance that the situation had required. Now there was no situation requiring distance. His hand was cool and certain against her jaw. "You were extraordinary." "I was prepared," she said. "There is a difference. There is not always one. Being able to prepare for something like that is itself extraordinary." Hey, he was very close. The violet eyes were doing something she had come to recognize, the particular quality they had when he was near the edge of the careful management he kept himself within and about to say something true. "I was afraid for you. I know," she said. "I was afraid too. I was very afraid." She let him see that, because she did not lie about true things, including fear. "But I was not going to let them talk about me like I was not in the room." "No," he agreed. "You were not." Something moved through his expression, complex and deep and warm. "I have loved you for longer than I told you," he said. "I want you to know that. I was careful with it, because being careful is what I do. But I have loved you since the night you asked me whether I had studied architectural history, because I watched it happen." The corner of his mouth moved, which is also when I knew you knew what I was, and had decided to know me anyway. Vera felt the full weight of it settle over her like something she had been waiting for, without knowing she was waiting. "I knew you were worth knowing," she said. "I was right." He kissed her in the blood court chamber, which no one had ever done before, because humans had not previously stood in it, in any capacity that invited such things. It was very quiet around them except for Xavian, who was still near the door, and who made no effort at all to pretend he was not watching, because in 800 years he had never seen the king kiss anyone in the chamber of adjudication, and he was not going to miss it. The weeks after the session were not without difficulty, because nothing in vampire politics resolved cleanly or finally. Aldraveth had lost the formal proceeding, but Aldraveth had been conducting vampire politics for 9 centuries, and he had not stayed relevant that long by accepting outcomes gracefully. The subsequent weeks involved what Xavian described to Vera as atmospheric pressure, which was his way of explaining that while no formal action could be taken, Aldraveth's house was making its displeasure visible through a series of minor political maneuvers designed to remind the court that they had not forgotten and were not finished. Vera took this information seriously because she was serious about the world she had entered. She spent hours with Xavian, learning the architecture of the 7 great houses, their histories, their grievances, their points of pride and vulnerability. Xavian was delighted to teach her, because Xavian had spent 800 years serving kings who rarely asked questions, and he found the experience of someone asking questions with genuine appetite enormously refreshing. She also, because she was who she was, asked Xavian directly what he was afraid of. He had been quiet for a moment. They were in the library again, which had become their room in the sense that it was where they ended up, regardless of where they started. Books spread across the table, the old lamps making warm pools in the stone space. "I am afraid that Aldraveth will find a way to put you in a position where I have to choose between you and the court," he said, "not legally. He has no legal avenue, but politically there are ways to create situations where a king's bond to a human becomes a governing liability rather than a personal one, where it begins to affect my ability to protect the people under this court's authority." Vera nodded slowly. "And what would you do?" "I would not renounce you," he said. It was not a romantic statement as much as a statement of fact, the way he talked about things that were simply true. "I would not renounce you under any circumstances, but I might need to make other choices, political concessions, agreements that cost me, the kind of compromises kings make when they have something that can be used against them." He looked at the table for a moment. "I want you to know that I consider that cost entirely worth paying, but I also want you to know it exists because you should understand completely what you have entered into." She had loved him for this, specifically and considerably, because it would have been very easy for someone in his position to protect her from exactly this kind of information. And he did not do that. He told her the true shape of things and trusted her to hold it. "What would make it harder for him to use me as leverage?" she asked. They had talked for 4 hours. What emerged from those 4 hours was a strategy that Vera recognized as essentially the same one she had used in the chamber: remove the vulnerability by making it a strength. If she was known in the court, recognized, present in ways that established her as an actor in vampire politics rather than a civilian attached to the king, she became a harder target. You could not leverage someone into obscurity who was already visible. She had begun appearing with Xavian at formal court functions, not as an accessory, as his bond partner, with the standing that legally entitled her to, asking questions, learning customs, demonstrating the kind of engaged intelligence that made her something other than a human woman attached to a vampire king by romantic accident. This had a polarizing effect, which they had anticipated. Some of the court found it offensive, others found it interesting, which in vampire terms was a form of respect. Councillor Mirev invited Vera for a private conversation that 3 hours and covered everything from blood court history to the current state of Eastern European vampire politics to Mirevel's own memory of the Covenant of Separation's original drafting, which she had witnessed. "It was not intended for what Aldraveth uses it for," Mirevel said. Her voice was dry and exact, the voice of someone who had watched centuries of people misuse things she helped build. "It was intended as protection. He uses it as exclusion. There is often not much distance between those two things," Vera said. Mirevel had looked at her for a moment. "No," she agreed, "there is not." A pause. "You are more than I expected. You expected a human woman who caught a vampire king's eye? Yes, I am also that," Vera said. "Both things are true." Mirevel had smiled. It was the smile of someone who had lived long enough to genuinely appreciate when both things were true simultaneously. The month that followed brought a more direct challenge. It came from Aldraveth's house, as they had known something eventually would, but the form it took surprised them both. A young vampire from Aldraveth's secondary house, a recent conversion barely 40 years into his immortality, appeared at the threshold of Meridian Bar and Grill at 11:30 on a Thursday night. Vera was working. Lena was working too. And she noticed the young vampire first because Lena had become very good at noticing vampires since Vera had explained the situation to her in considerable detail. The young vampire's name, Vera learned later, was Phelan. He had been sent not to threaten her, but to speak to her, which was more sophisticated and therefore more concerning. He ordered a drink, and he waited, patient with the particular patience of someone who has been told to wait. And when Vera came to his end of the bar, he said, "I have a message for you from Councillor Aldraveth. You can tell Councillor Aldraveth that my preferred channel for communication is through my bond partner," Vera said pleasantly. "He is aware of how to reach him." "The message is for you specifically," Phelan said. He was young enough that he was not entirely comfortable with what he was doing, which Vera noted because she read people very well. "He wants you to understand that your presence in the court is destabilizing it. That your bond partner, regardless of what he has told you, has responsibilities that will eventually require him to make choices you will not be part of. That humans who insert themselves into immortal politics do not age well." He had not meant the last part as a threat about age specifically. He had meant it as a broader statement about outcomes. Vera understood this and chose not to pretend she did not. "Tell Councillor Aldraveth," she said with the same pleasant tone, "that I am aware of everything you have just said, that I have considered it seriously, and that I am still here." She picked up his untouched drink and set it down in front of him with a small, precise motion. "Also tell him that the next time he wants to send someone to speak to me, he should send someone who is not clearly uncomfortable with the errand. It diminishes the effect." Phelan looked at her. Something moved through his young old face that might have been respect if it had been directed by anyone he had been permitted to respect. He nodded once, took his drink, and left. Vera called Zahn before she finished her shift. He arrived at Meridian within 7 minutes, which was not physically possible by any human route from the underground palace, and she knew better than to ask about the route. He came in through the back entrance, which was technically staff only, and found her in the employee break room. And he looked at her face first, and then the rest of her, checking with the quick automatic assessment she had come to recognize as his version of asking if she was all right. "I am fine," she said. "He did not threaten me. He tried to make me doubt this, which is a different thing." Xavian sat on the edge of the break room table. He was wearing his dark coat over an open-collared shirt, which was his version of casual, and in the harsh fluorescent light of the employee break room, He looked exactly like what he was, something ancient and dangerous and deeply attached to the person standing 3 feet away from him. "What did you tell him?" She relayed the conversation. He listened without interrupting. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. "Does what he said affect you?" he asked. Careful and direct. "Of course it does," she said. "I think about it already. I am human. You are not. The math of that is not simple, and I am not going to pretend it is simple, because pretending things are simple is how people end up blindsided." She looked at him steadily. "But I have never made choices because they were simple. I make them because they are right. And choosing you is right." He crossed the break room in 2 steps and held her with the specific force of someone who has been made very aware of how much they have to lose. His hands were in her hair. His forehead rested against hers. "I have been thinking about it too," he said very quietly. "The question of time, I know. There is a mechanism," he said, with the careful precision of someone who has thought about something from every angle before speaking. "Under the old compact, a declared bond of sufficient depth and duration can be petitioned for extension. The bond itself, over time, creates a connection between 2 life forces that can be formalized. It is not immortality given, it is life extended. A bridge, not a translation." He paused. "It is rarely done. It requires both parties to survive long enough for the bond deepen to the threshold required, and for the petition to be granted by the court." "By the court," Vera repeated slowly, "by a full court majority. 9 of 12. She considered this. "We currently have at least 5 who would not vote against us. We currently have 5 who would vote for us, which is not quite the same number but is close," he agreed. "Over time, with the work we have been doing, more." He pulled back enough to look at her face. His expression was everything it was, in their most honest moments, stripped of the regal, the careful, the managed, just Xavian, with all 600 years of him at the surface. "I am not asking you to plan your life around a petition that may not succeed. I am telling you that I intend to spend whatever time we have working toward it, because I am not able to imagine an alternative I am willing to accept." Vera took his face in her hands. He was cool and precise, and hers, in all the complicated, serious, important ways of that word. "We have time," she said. "We have work to do, and we have time to do it. That is enough." He closed his eyes for one moment, in the way she had learned, meant he was allowing himself to feel something he normally kept at careful distance. Then he opened them and looked at her with the full force of 600 years of accumulated love that had mostly been set aside because nothing had seemed worth the risk. She had seemed worth the risk. She was worth it. He had been right. The following months continued to be complicated and continued to be something she would not have traded. The vampire court was a living political ecosystem, constantly shifting, and her presence in it continued to polarize and continue to interest and continued to create new tensions and new alliances in roughly equal measure. Aldravith did not disappear from the landscape. He was too old and too embedded to disappear. But the statute of finality held, and his formal avenues were closed, and what he had left were the informal channels, which were significant but required time and subtlety that worked against the rapid destabilization he had been hoping for. Mirev became, over those months, something approaching a political ally and something approaching a friend, in the limited, careful way that 800-year-old vampires permitted friendships. She gave Vera 2 more private conversations and a great deal of indirect political guidance. And in return, Vera gave her the experience of speaking to someone who completely honest with her, which Mirev later confided, had become considerably rarer at her age than she would have liked. Xavian gave Vera a formal education in blood court history, protocol, and law that would have constituted a graduate degree if institutions existed to confer it. He was the best teacher she had ever had, precise and passionate, and possessed of an 800-year perspective that made every historical moment she had ever studied suddenly acquire a third dimension. She passed her university examinations, all of them, because she was also still doing that, because she had plans that predated Xavian, and she saw no reason to abandon plans simply because she had also fallen catastrophically and correctly in love. She was going to finish her degree. She was going to write her thesis on the architectural evolution of Prague's underground structures, which she was now uniquely positioned to research. And Xavian had already begun clearing access to areas of the underground complex that she could use as primary sources in ways that would make her supervising professor either very impressed or very confused. Xavian attended her thesis defense. He sat at the back of the university's seminar room in his dark coat with his white hair and his ancient, violet eyes, and looked completely unremarkable to anyone who was not paying close attention, which most academics were not, because they were too busy paying attention to the thesis. The thesis received the highest grade available in the Charles University system, and her supervisor described it as a work of unusual depth and primary source access. And Vera shook hands and accepted congratulations and found Xavian afterward in the corridor, where he took her hand and held it with complete possession, and something running under his stillness that she recognized as pride. "You are very pleased with yourself," she said. "I am very pleased with you," he said. "There is a distinction. You helped with the primary source access. You did the work." She always did. There was a night, 6 months after the court session, when Aldravith made his last significant move. Not a legal one, because the statute held. Not a personal one, because Vera had become too visible and too well regarded by enough of the court to make her a viable personal target. What he did was political, a formal coalition argument to the court that the king's bond to a human constituted a governance crisis requiring extraordinary measures. He called for a vote of confidence in Xavian's kingship. Xavian had been expecting it. They had together been building toward the response for months. The vote of confidence in the blood court required a full council session. All 12 members present, majority to unset. 7 of 12, Aldravith had 3. He had spent 6 months trying to reach 7, and Vera had spent 6 months watching the attempts with the careful attention of someone who understood that the most important work she could do was not dramatic or visible. It was the conversations, the honesty, the presence. Councillor Mirev and 4 others were firm. 2 more were persuadable. Aldravith needed both of them. They gave him neither. The vote of confidence failed, 6-6, and a tied vote under blood court statute meant the sitting monarch retained his position. Aldravith, after the session, left the chamber without speaking to anyone. He would continue to be a problem because people like Aldravith did not stop being problems. But he had exhausted his primary weapons, and he knew it, and the court knew it, and everyone settled into a new configuration that acknowledged Xavian's bond to Vera Sinclair as an established fact of their political landscape. This was, in vampire terms, the equivalent of acceptance, not universal acceptance, not uncomplicated acceptance, but the acknowledgement that comes when something has survived every attempt to dislodge it and everyone recalibrates to its existence. Vera understood that this was not the end of anything. It was the beginning of the long, complex, ongoing work of being who she was in the world. She had entered, she was entirely willing to do that work. On the night of the 6-month anniversary of the Bond Declaration, Xavian took her to a part of the underground complex she had not been to before. It required descending further than the library, further than the council chambers, to a level that smelled older than anything she had encountered, stone smoothed by centuries of air moving through small spaces. The room at the end of the passage was not large. It held a single window, which was impossible this far underground, until you understood that it was not a window in the conventional sense, but an aperture engineered over centuries that caught and reflected natural light down through a series of mirrors built into the building above, so that even here, this deep below Prague, there was a thin silver light that spoke of the surface world. In the center of the room was a stone surface, old and smooth, with markings carved into it that Vera recognized as old court script. She did not know this script as well as the spoken language, but she had been studying it, and she could read enough to understand what she was looking at. "The original Bond stone," she said quietly. "The first blood court in Central Europe formalized bonds here," Xavian said. He was standing beside her, close enough that his shoulder was against hers. "Before the upper chambers were built, before the court became what it is now," he looked at the stone. "I have not brought anyone here in a very long time. Why did you bring me now?" He was quiet for a moment. Not the managing kind of quiet, the honest kind. "Because I wanted you to see it," he said simply. "Because you are the person I want to show things to. Because I have spent 600 years in these rooms, and you are the first person who has made me feel that I am still learning what they mean." He looked at her with the full, unguarded openness of the Bond Declaration ceremony. No management, no careful distance, just the complete and serious truth. "I love you, Vera Sinclair, not because you saved my political position, though you did, not because you stood in that chamber and out-argued my counsel, though you did that too. Because you are honest, and you are brave, and you look at things, including me, and call them what they are. Because being with you makes me better at being what I am. Because I cannot imagine any version of whatever time I have that does not include you in it." The thin silver light from the ancient mirror window fell across the Bond stone and across his face, and he was beautiful in it, pale and precise, and 600 years of something that had finally found the thing it had been keeping itself too careful to reach for. Vera took his hand. It was cool and certain in hers. "You know what I love about you," she said. "Tell me. You told me the truth from the beginning, even when it was complicated, even when it was dangerous. You told me what I was entering into completely because you thought I had the right to know it." She pressed his hand between both of hers. "Do you know how rare that is? Being someone who tells the truth because they respect the person they are telling it to. You make it easy," he said. "You look at things until they tell you what they are. There is no point lying to someone like that. There is always a point. Most people do it anyway." She stepped closer. "You did not. That is why I trust you. That is why this is real." He pulled her in and held her in the old room with the silver light on the Bond stone. And it was quiet and complete, the kind of quiet that exists on the far side of everything difficult, when you have done the work and survived it and arrived. Some you chose together. The petition for bond extension took 4 years to formally prepare and 2 council sessions to argue. Vera was 27 when the bond was declared and 31 when the petition was filed, and she argued part of it herself, because she had by then developed a command of blood court law that was, as Casavith said with great pride, frankly embarrassing to several vampires who have had considerably longer to study it. The petition required 9 votes. They had 9 on the first ballot, with Mirev casting the deciding vote, with the dry precision of someone who had been waiting to use it for exactly this purpose. Aldraveth abstained. It was not agreement. It was acknowledgement that the weight had shifted permanently, and even Aldraveth understood, when the weight had shifted permanently, the extension mechanism was not what Vera had imagined, because she had been wise enough not to imagine it too concretely, which she felt had been the correct approach. It was not a transformation. She did not become a vampire. She remained who she was, human and mortal and honest about both things, but the bond between them, deep and old now by every measure that mattered, carried something that the court formally recognized as an extension of life force. Not immortality, not unchanging duration. A long, long life that would not match his, but would not leave her at 31, while he remained unchanged for centuries. It was imperfect. It was honest about being imperfect. It was the best available answer to a question that did not have a perfect one. She had told him, when the petition was granted and they were alone in the library that was their room, that she would have chosen this regardless, that the time she had already had with him was already worth whatever the limits of it were, that she had not made this choice hoping for the petition to succeed, but because the choice itself was correct. He had looked at her for a long moment. "I know," he said. "That is why I love you." She kissed him in the library, with the old lamps warm around them and the books at their backs, and the whole underground world of his life becoming, year by year, also the world of hers. She kissed him and held him and let herself be held by something 600 years old that was still, after everything, capable of learning how to be careful with the things that mattered. Above them, Prague moved through its modern evening, trams running, restaurants filling, the city's old streets lit with the practical light of the present. Below, in the stone corridors of a world most people never knew existed, 2 people who had found each other in a basement bar over a glass of wine that one of them never drank were building something that had not existed before. It was not simple. It would never be simple. The court would continue to be the court, with its politics and its resentments, and its ancient grudges, and its occasional extraordinary persons like Mirev, who had seen enough to know the difference between change and destruction. Aldraveth would continue to be Aldraveth, diminished in formal power but not in presence. The 7 great houses would continue their slow political orbits around the court's gravity. The world above would continue its modern rhythms, mostly unaware of the world below. Vera would continue to be someone who looked at things honestly and called them what they were. She would finish her architectural history degree and begin another area of study, because she had discovered that the vampire world had several thousand years of undocumented history, that someone with her skills and access was uniquely placed to examine properly, and she thought someone should do it properly. She would continue to take the conversations that other people found difficult and treat them as what they were, problems with solutions worth finding. She would continue to be impossible to leverage because she could not be frightened into obscurity when she had already chosen to be visible. Xavian would continue to be a king, which meant that the work was never done and the problems were always larger than anyone would prefer, and the cost of holding the court to its own best standards was the constant grinding work of doing exactly that, but he would do it as he told her once in the library at 3 in the morning, when they had been arguing about the ethical implications of a blood court policy. She had found troubling with someone beside him who told him when he was wrong and meant it when she said he was right, and who had never once looked at the throne and seen a shortcut to anything she wanted. She had looked at the throne and seen his, and been glad it was his, and told him so in the room with the bond stone and the thin silver light from the ancient mirror window. They had found the word for what they were building together, not in old court script or blood law terminology or any of the ancient languages that had accumulated in Xavian's 6 centuries, but in the plain, honest human language that Vera used when she wanted to say something true. It was called a life, an actual life, built carefully between 2 people who had looked at each other without pretense and chosen what they found there. And it would be long and complicated and full of the specific difficulty of existing between 2 worlds that had not always managed that existence gracefully. And it would be worth every single part of it. It was the most honest thing either of them had ever done. And that was, they both knew, exactly right.